So welcome everyone to our presentation today. We are so glad that y'all joined us, and we are excited to be here with y'all at the Association for Adult Development and Aging Conference. My apologies that we started a little bit late. It sounds like every session was running over. So from the 10 a.m. and then we were running into some technology glitches this morning, but we are so glad to be here together and for you to join us. What I was also going to say was before we get started, because we have a small audience today, we hope that this will be as engaging for you. So feel free to ask us questions. Feel free to share any of your experiences, thoughts, ideas. Particularly what this is covering for us is a foundation for several research studies that our team is implementing, and it's actually in the process of. So that's really the source of where we've developed this. And so again, this is oppression, help seeking, and relational satisfaction in sexual and gender minority relationships, a developmental synthesis. My name is Christian Chan. I am an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I'm also the couple and family track coordinator. So very much this is home to me, not only because of my areas of research interest, but also because I do it in teaching and service too. So what I was going to say was, with that being said, my pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm also going to pass it to our brilliant research team and colleagues here today. So Nicole or Jasmine, I don't know which of you would like to go first.
I can go first. Thank you, Dr. Chan. My name is Nicole Silverio. I'm a second-year doctoral student here at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, under the mentorship of Dr. Chan for a lot of these really exciting projects. I have my master's degree from the University of Central Florida. I'm also a nationally certified counselor and a licensed mental health counselor and licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of Florida. And just excited to be here with y'all today. My pronouns are she, her, hers.
So I'll go. So my name is Jasmine Garland McKinney. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm also a second-year doctoral student at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I am a licensed clinical mental health counselor associate. That's a mouthful. A nationally certified counselor and also a professional school counselor in North Carolina. I am working with Dr. Chan on all of these really great projects, just like Nicole said. My research interests are focused on the areas of maternal mental health and how Black women's experiences with motherhood, pregnancy, and childbirth are exacerbated by race-based disparities. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm really happy that you all are here, and I hope that we can have a really engaging presentation with you all this morning.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Jasmine. We also, a member of our research team and co-leading the research team with me is Dr. Jennifer Deaton, who couldn't be here with us today. So certainly, but also want to give a huge shout out to Dr. Deaton for the co-leadership of our research projects and our team. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in to our time together here today. So we wanted to start out by essentially describing some of the main key aspects of what is foundational to our research, what has already been established as overall trends, and some of the implications that we would have for that, both in practice and research. Where we start funneling down, right, it's not only because of what we've seen, right, in terms of like going from like just like applying or trying to examine or even measure theory, right? Like what we looked at was, okay, here's something that we're certainly wrestling with, particularly as a huge gap, for sexual and gender minority relationships. So in its vein, this is essentially interdisciplinary because we draw primarily from research and literature that isn't just covered in our counseling journals. So it's in our counseling journals, but also in family science journals. So very much if you think about the National Council on Family Relations, If you think about the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, so AMFT, so very much covered in these different aspects and these different disciplines and professions. So one of the key pieces that we often know, right, from the research is that relationship satisfaction increases, and it has this connection, particularly to overall feelings of support. It also has a connection to physical and mental health conditions. So when you think about someone's emotional well-being, think about their physical well-being, it very much is a huge part of who we are, right? So in that vein, that's where that relationship satisfaction, if we know that it's going to promote and going to help by promoting that, in not only in our couples modalities, but just as we think about this as a like conceptually, right? It's also going to produce these other effects. The other piece too, because if there's a safe and secure attachment, particularly in, that's how it's related to relational satisfaction, you're also going to have stronger emotional regulation. So that's a key piece of understanding just a broad scope of relational satisfaction research. Now, what that, you know, and this is again, really openly much broader, right? Because, you know, we think about relational satisfaction for intimate relationships. Intimate relationships could be someone cohabitating, it could be someone who's married. So there's a wide, extensive body that we're covering in terms of couples and intimate relationship research. Now, here's the interesting piece, right? And this is still, even as much research continues to burgeon in this way with intimate relationship research, the reality is that it's still heteronormative and cisnormative. I mean, you know, Rin Retchek actually talks a lot about this, not just in this 2020 article, but all throughout their entire body of research, talking about how even though, yes, like we're seeing like certain studies like pop up here and there, like maybe throughout the years, it's predominantly when we think about couples, right? We think about intimate relationship, everybody often goes to single partner, often a partner of the other gender. Like it's always like very heteronormative. And that's where people tend to align. If you think about this in clinical practice, right? Most people often think, right? When you think about a couple, and this is how I teach like family and couples classes, right? I talk to our students and I really dispel all the myths. Like that's what we go through, because every time when someone imagines couples counseling, they often think, oh, often white, often heteronormative, often cisnormative. It's always someone like two different genders in the relationship. And I think we're also expanding this broadly, not necessarily within the scope of these studies, but where this could also maximize more is when we think about polyamorous and non-monogamous couples. So again, this is where, but the key takeaway here is that still the overall trend in couples and intimate relationship research is very heteronormative and cisnormative. And so when you think about that, it certainly has become this very prime, visible area that family science researchers and family and couples researchers not only are attempting to explore, but are encouraged to explore. So the other piece here, I also want to dovetail this, is that particularly Black, Indigenous people of color and gender minority couples are far less studied. So here's the interesting piece. Like when we think now, like even with the burgeoning body of research that supports intimate relationship research, specifically within the scope of SGM relationships, BIPOC and gender minority couples are far less studied. It's really interesting when you think about this. Actually, I recommend somebody look at the Spengler study. It was really interesting to see what they found in that meta-analysis, because they went through the demographics of all these outcome research studies, and they said, interestingly, that in the demographics, the least reported, right, are race, sexual, and gender identities. Right, and they tend to conflate race and social class together. Yeah, it was so compelling, like to see that, and it's a recent meta-analysis. So, but it implored. Oh, I was seeing something in the chat. Oh, is it paused?
I think it's frozen, Dr. Chan, so we can only see the first slide on the Zoom.
Oh no. Okay. All right. So let me see what I can do here. It also might help if it's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and also stop my video just in case that might be affecting it. So, but let me share where we're at. Is this working? But it might be showing the presenter view, but that's okay too. So
It's working.
okay, perfect. So and just making sure. There we go. Okay, so as we think about the other piece here, in that particularly in that meta-analysis, the reality is race, sexual, and gender identities are still the least reported demographics, especially when you think about outcome research studies with couples. Now, I find them to be really compelling, right? That you report everything else, and that's where some of these assumptions are coming from. It's like, oh, we assume that because if you're in the same gender relationship, or that your partner is of the same gender, that automatically that gives you like this idea like, oh, well, then you must be a SGM couple. So they don't actually, and that was something that Spangler and colleagues really tried to dismantle, was this whole idea, okay, well, the other piece is that we're now implying assumptions upon couples based on how they've already identified in study without giving them the means to self-label, right? Both qualitatively and quantitatively. So something to think about when you're walking away from today with some ways that you even think about, even if you're doing a quant study, right? How are you? It was a Journal of Marriage and Family Therapy. So it's AMFT's journal. Yeah, I can send you the article if you'd like to see it later. So the other piece too is, so there's this like two-pronged trend that has happened in the last, I would say 6-7 years, right? And of course, like now there's an increased focus for SGM relationships overall, because we know that SGM relationships play a huge part, like I was sharing earlier, right, about relational satisfaction. It plays a huge part in our well-being. So when we try to unpack health conditions and health disparities, right, that really does say a lot about, well, you know, part of that, nobody really kind of ties that together, or like many people don't often tie that together, but it's become even more visibly important to family science researchers, especially, that there you can't hold those elements as mutually exclusive. Health conditions, health disparities, and relational satisfaction are very much intricately woven together. The other piece too is that why this has surfaced even more so in the last 6 years is because a lot of researchers are knowingly now studying the social phenomenon, right? The fact that, you know, Obergefell and Hodges like basically got passed. So we now have marriage equality, right? How we often frame that as marriage equality and how that is applied to SGM relationships. The reality is that even with those positive changes, so people are assuming like, you know, we're now embracing SGM relationships as a norm, but still there are barriers that are put into place. One of the key pieces that even though that has happened policy-wise, the reality is that unequal relationship recognition, right? So still knowing that you're still going to face stigma, marginalization, and oppression as you live in the world. That's still happening for SGM relationships and partners who are in SGM relationships. So very much highlighting that piece. And the other piece here is that there's still a persistent gap in outcome research. So a lot of our research, yes, like describes social phenomena, describes experiences, but a lot, and this is actually what, when we think about modalities, like couples counseling modalities or couples therapy modalities, it is still a missing gap, particularly in outcome research. So there's not much outcome research. There's more like, of course, like understanding experiences, understanding trends, doing secondary data analyses, but not necessarily like establishing a structure for SGM couples with outcome research, like a very structured outcome research study. So the other piece here, we talked a bit about this already, but like that social and structural stigma do impact intimate relationships. We know that to also occur, right? That it's also like when you get that kind of pressure from social and structural stigma, whether that's racism, heterosexism, genderism, that it's also going to impact your own relational satisfaction. It impacts even the way that you view your own relationship. I mean, if you think about it, right? Like, it's like, yeah, like if this is how people are going to perceive me, it's going to change the way that I see my relationship, but also the way that I interact in my relationship. The other piece here, and this is what really led us to really also explore race-based trauma as a significant part of our research projects, was we see this kind of like mixture of studies, right? That among individuals and couples relationships where particularly like queer and trans people of color. So yes, like it's become important, but everything, if you take a look in the last like 6 years, tends to be conceptual and also tends to be qualitative, which makes sense, especially if people are trying to apply intersectionality and wrestle with intersectionality. There's a lot of focus on qualitative research. That's important. And I think in many capacities, we also need to complement it, right? But also that's striking to me, right? About what's happening in the samples themselves. You know, Green and colleagues and LeBlanc and colleagues actually talk about this, where several studies, it's not, you know, it's not just in the discussion, but I actually think what is so cool is like they made intentional efforts and they introduced mechanisms to try to make sure they maximized on diversifying their sample to include BIPOC individuals, LGBTQ plus BIPOC individuals in their research, quantitatively actually. So this is an important aspect of that. And then the two other pieces that I want to highlight and what brought us to later when Jasmine will describe and talk through race-based traumatic stress, that particularly for queer and trans people of color, as they're navigating SGM relationships and help seeking, what they're often also seeing, right, is they're negotiating and working through their like social identities. So that's an important part of the work as well. So we attend to that not only, you know, I can talk to you like all day, like about intersectionality theory. So we can definitely talk about that. Like that'll probably be a 6-hour meeting time. So, but also in that vein, this is where I come back to that social and structural stigma. They're navigating racism, genderism, and heterosexism. So that's a big piece of this, and where we sort of started drawing not just from minority stress theory, right, but also race-based trauma. And so we'll get to that in a moment because I want to make sure that we stay to our time. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Nicole.
Yeah, so I am going to talk a little bit about minority stress theory and really how that has a relationship with STM help seeking. So with the minority stress model, it really talks about kind of like this juxtaposition between minority values and kind of being popped into this ocean of dominant culture values, and how that really ends up creating really adverse and hostile social environments for SGM and LGBTQ plus individuals. And as conceptualized by Meyer, it really included these three elements that we have up here on the slides. The first one is internalized homophobia, which was theorized to kind of be the result of this prolonged exposure to anti-LGBTQ attitudes. And so eventually through socialization, that becomes internalized, and some of those anti-LGBTQ sentiments are directed at the self, unfortunately. The second one on there is perceived stigma. And so in this one, Meyer really talks about how experiences of violence, experiences of prejudice and discrimination really end up creating this sense of heightened sense of vigilance, right? And so you're perceiving the stigma that you're experiencing, and then you're also kind of being cautious in the social environments that you're in, and then your circles, right? Because you don't know when you might experience that that violence or that discrimination again. And so that heightened sense of vigilance is tied to kind of poor mental health outcomes, as you can imagine, right? Always being cautious and feeling worried that you might have to experience something like that. And then the last one on here is just the actual experience of discrimination and violence, and really something that is sadly still a big part of the LGBTQ experience, and kind of living here in the US and probably a lot of other parts of the world. And so, how minority stress theory really ties into help seeking is that these experiences of discrimination and stigma have been found to act as a barrier to help seeking. So, if you're vigilant and worried, right, about how you might be treated, about experiencing rejection or experiencing perhaps judgment, right, then that's going to have an impact on how willing and likely you are to seek out services, including social services like mental health. And so one of the things that that was really interesting is that that's the case even in the face of psychological distress. So even when people need the help, they're really hesitant to go look for it because of some of these stressors. And so that is particularly concerning because when you look at minority stress, you can also see that is tied to poor mental health outcomes. And so if you go on the next slide for me, Dr. Chan. Thank you. So, so not only does it negatively impact your help seeking, but then it's also increasing perhaps your psychological distress, where you might, at times when you might be more in need of seeking this, of getting the support, you're also kind of feeling cautious of seeking it out. And so for STM individuals, minority stress, experiences with stigma, discrimination, violence, all those things have been tied to poor mental health outcomes, including depression, anxiety, increased risk of substance use and abuse, and just psychological distress in general. And then for couples, it's been tied to lower perceived relationship quality, lower relationship satisfaction, and lower relationship functioning. So you could really see how these really stressful experiences have an impact on the individual, but also in the relationships that LGBTQ plus people engage in. So. And I will hand it over to Jasmine to talk a little bit about race-based stress and trauma.
Yeah, so when we think about race-based trauma, there's kind of a lot of definitions that can be put out there for what exactly is race-based trauma, how does it happen, who is involved in it, what are the parties. And so I'm going to spend just a little bit of time kind of providing the foundation for race-based trauma based on Carter 2007. So we do use the Carter article a lot in our studies because of the non-pathological definitions of what race-based trauma is. And so what we've seen in prior articles before Carter is that race-based trauma was kind of defined as a physical characteristic. So it was just limited to physical occurrences. So if you encountered someone and they were physically violent to you, that is what would consist of race-based trauma prior to the Carter article. But what Carter does is take that and then put a non-pathological definition to that race-based trauma. It can be physical pain, or it can be emotional or psychological pain as well. And so those events result from racism. And so when we get into the levels of racial encounters, just like Nicole talked about with the minority stress model, there are also 3 levels within race-based trauma in this model. And I'll talk a little bit more about the levels on the next slide. But for these levels, we want to think about interpersonal, so the person, the culture that they bring. And so that can be race and ethnicity, that can be sexuality, any kind of culture that the person defines for themselves. And then we also think about the structural or systemic barriers that could impact racist encounters. And so once we talk about symptomology, we get into that re-experiencing of the traumatic event. So constantly replaying it in your mind. If you have a racist encounter, you can't get it off your mind. And so you're constantly living in that moment of what happened to you. But then on the other side of that, we also get some of the numbing of that traumatic event. And so when we see symptoms of this in individuals, we see that we want to avoid that event at all. Don't want to talk about it. Don't want to think about it. It's out of sight, out of mind. It's almost like it never happened. And then on the third level, we get to kind of what Nicole was talking about with the minority stress model, is that increased vigilance, that you have to always be, constantly aware of your surroundings and how your surroundings can impact your physical, emotional, and psychological well-being. So now for the next slide, I will talk just a little bit about what the levels of racial encounters are for race-based trauma. And so we get into kind of this cycle of how race-based traumatic events happen. So at the epicenter of these events, we have an event that is viewed by an individual as negative, memorable, sudden, and uncontrollable. So it can be any four of these characteristics, or it can be all four of them combined. And then on the outside, we get to those three levels that I talked about: interpersonal, cultural, and then systemic. So I can't see the audience, but I wanted to ask if anybody could point out which level do you think would be a cultural factor for a level of racist encounter? Or Dr. Rodriguez, since you're on our call. So which level is a cultural level of a racist encounter? Would that be racial discrimination, racial harassment, or discriminatory harassment, based on the examples that I provided?
Everyone is, it sounds like all of them.
So it could definitely be all of them, but the one that is focused on the cultural level of a racist encounter would be racial harassment. So that is when someone views you as a stereotype based on what they think your culture is. So based on, for me, based on what they think a Black woman should act like, or based on what they think a mother should act like. So they stereotype you based on that. And so then, based on those stereotypes, we see the physical, interpersonal, or verbal assaults. And then for interpersonal, we have the bearing access, the exclusion, and then withholding information. So those are really targeted attacks on an individual from another individual. And then on the other side, we have systemic or structural encounters of racial events. And so that's discriminatory harassment. And so that can be denial of promotion, question of qualifications. Once you get into those systemic levels or institutional structures, when people try to deny you based on your race or based on your ethnicity, that's when a racial traumatic event can happen at the systemic level. Good job. Thanks for participating, everyone.
Okay.
So finally, for our purposes of our presentation, we really want to know, how does race-based trauma impact depression? How does it go with oppression? And how does it impact help-seeking rates? So the first thing I wanted to touch on for this slide is intersectionality. So just like Dr. Chan said, when we have the intersection of multiple minoritized identities and multiple systems of oppression, we get a kind of epicenter of all of these events that can cause race-based traumatic experiences. And so I put under this some barriers to help seeking that are based on race-based trauma. But as you could see with what Nicole was saying, what Dr. Chan was saying, these can really fit into all of the research studies that have been studied on SGM couples and LGBTQ individuals. So what we see is that some of the barriers to help seeking, particularly with individuals who are describing race-based traumatic experiences, are discrimination of providers, mistrust of systemic systems, stigma against mental health access, and then also access to culturally responsive providers. So like Nicole and I have talked about, when there's this hypervigilance of what people are thinking of you, what they can do to you, you can imagine that when you come into this system, the mental health system, the medical system, any of these systems, that there also can be people who will unintentionally or intentionally cause you harm based on your identity. And so those are some of the barriers that we see to help seeking. On the other side of those things, though, we do see some additional forms of help seeking that are often termed as non-traditional. And so we will see culturally specific coping mechanisms. For example, in Black communities, Afrocultural coping mechanisms are used instead of the more traditional mental health seeking mental health providers out. And then we also see fictive kin relationships or chosen families. So instead of having biological or adoptive families, individuals will go out and seek their own families and those who they feel support from and those who they feel accepted by.
All right. So we're going to transition to kind of include identity affirmation as part of our conversation today, and really how it interacts with SGM relationships and the project that we're doing. So identity affirmation really refers to the positive feeling of being associated with you or having a sense of belonging to your community and to your social group. And so it could apply to multiple identities. And in this slide, we're talking about specifically as it pertains to LGBTQ plus individuals. And so there can definitely be identity affirming experiences, right? Like when you choose to use somebody's preferred pronouns, right? That can really assist in the identity affirmation process of that person. And so identity affirmation is really important because high levels of it have been linked to improve social resources, improve psychological well-being for LGBTQ plus people. And some studies have really found that a higher level of social support is associated with stronger feelings of identity affirmation. So you kind of get this increase in social support, but then the social support has this reciprocal relationship, right, where it also contributes to our identity affirmation. And so given that intimate partner relationships, right, are a part of our social support network, especially when they're really healthy ones. It may not be really surprising to find that SGM relationships tend to experience increased levels of identity affirmation when they're in these long-term healthy SGM relationships, which makes it really interesting for us, right? Because we're really trying to find out how that may act as a protective factor and really change help seeking for SGM individuals who are in a relationship. But like Dr. Chan was sharing a little earlier today, as we were kind of doing more research for this presentation and also for our projects, it's just really evident that there's a lot of need for additional research and for us to just understand this better and learn more about it, so that it can have some of those clinical implications and practice implications that we all hope to reach.
Even based on our conversation today, there are a few themes that we're reflecting on, right? And that we're hoping to also, with the data that we collect, also still build in possibilities to not necessarily just confirm, but to enhance what we know in these overall trends in research. So as we think about the culmination of all the topics that we've discussed today, we recognize particularly SGM relationships, why they're so vital, right? One is because there's different components of intimate relationship support versus family support. So for somebody who is in a SGM relationship, you're probably thinking, okay, like what the research has also covered and what is important for us to think about as practitioners is that the reason why we hone in on relational satisfaction is because that can be the source of support, right? That can buffer the negative experiences of discrimination that especially come from family members. And it also provides some other ways, right, to not only promote the overall ability to seek help, but also to engage and still maintain the integrity of like someone's family, right? Because this is the other reality that in some of the research that also is covered, what we also see is that particularly for queer and trans people of color, what is so important is that, it's not necessarily just saying, oh, well, disavow your family, right? Or like disavow like the family that you've grown up with. If I did that, there would probably all hell would break loose. Like, it's like, yeah, I can't just like, oh yeah, I'm gonna like just like let go of my family. They're gonna let go of me. I was like, that's not how this works, right? Like, I was like, that's not how this is gonna work for me. So, and at the same time, in an intimate relationship, like it's sort of like I'm navigating both worlds. So I think that's the other added layer that we are not only exploring in these projects, but also we're going to continue exploring with future projects down the line, particularly for queer and trans people of color. The other piece too is understanding that, relationship satisfaction and relational health are tied to well-being, right? Are tied to not just interpersonal well-being, but also like individual emotional and mental health and physical health. So, and that's where that minority stress theory does have some additional background for what we're talking about here in SGM intimate relationships. But I think about that, right? So even if you're counseling individuals, help them talk through like, okay, what are they like, what sort of like, talk to me a little bit about what like intimate relationship histories, or like what does that really mean to them? And so focusing on relational health can also be an integral factor in understanding overall well-being. The other piece here is, so I was also going to add this in, but as we think about psychoeducation on oppression, so really bring in explicit conversations about the impact of social and structural stigma. It's like very much as we think about broaching, right? So, one of several of our colleagues, but especially one of my colleagues, shout out to Dr. Connie Jones and all her work on broaching. But the reality is like, that's part of what we think about infusing, right? Like that you're not just, okay, I'm also navigating our cultural interactions between me and another person or me and the client, but also how am I infusing systemic components, right? Structural and social stigma into these explicit conversations, because it, in many ways, some of our clients don't always realize, or maybe aren't like sometimes eschew that, right? They say, oh, well, that's not the source of like what I'm experiencing with my trauma. That's not the source of what I'm experiencing with my depression or anxiety symptoms. So, but in reality, it could certainly have a connection. And it behooves us as counseling practitioners and researchers to really continue to have explicit discussions on that. The other piece here is also realizing that intersectionality serves as an underpin, right? For all the work that we do, especially as we think not just in SGM relationships, but also queer and trans people of color in SGM relationships. So the reality is like, Skylar Jackson and colleagues really talk a lot about this, but I really appreciate their study, because one of the key pieces is that they knew, like, if you're asking someone to basically split up their identities, it actually decreases overall well-being. So it's much more that affirmation that living in your truth and knowing that you can integrate all your social identities, for example, race, sexuality, and gender identity together, can promote overall well-being. So that's an important aspect of this. But again, this is where I was tying that in with affirming lived experiences specific to LGBTQ plus BIPOC individuals and communities. So the other piece here is we cultivated these overall themes. Of course, like we're undertaking quant research projects right now. The hope is that expanding this into even larger body for our team, but really thinking about both qualitatively and quantitatively moving forward. But one of the key pieces that we wanted to leave everybody with today was to think about how you're strategizing the incorporation of samples of LGBTQ plus BIPOC individuals and partners and communities into your work. So also shout out to Dr. Tani Dari, who's here in the audience with us. But the reality is part of what we do is we have to create community partnerships, because I think this is what happens, right? Everybody solicits samples like, oh, participate. And even if it's like general, like, okay, if you're identifying as part of an SGM relationship, most of the people who are going to participate, right, are typically white. Like, so that's what's going to happen. And so that's what we often see. The other piece too is that the broader spectrum of research that focuses on that intersection between LGBTQ plus and BIPOC communities is that it's primarily qualitative. There's a purpose to that. And I think what we're undertaking here in our own research is we're also expanding it quantitatively. I will also say, again, like a shout out to LeBlanc and colleagues, like several researchers have not only identified that, but also tried to make sure, how do I strategize to diversify the sample? Yes. Yes, yes. And I think so there's of course like different ways that we've had to navigate. I think one of the pieces is that it slows down the process, right? Like it's definitely not like, you know, how people talk about the magic of I solicited a sample in like a week or two. And I'm like, I'm really curious about what your inclusion criteria was. So what was that? It does, it does. And oh, sorry. Yes. Just to repeat the question was, you know, specific to LGBTQ plus BIPOC individuals, like what community partners have you sought out, or like how has that like worked? So that was the question. The other piece too is that we've wait, and you know, this is like a part, especially because we're doing research that's a focus, like this is essentially clinical research that's focused on the public. So one of the key pieces is that we're using crowdsourcing. Now, if we were doing this research with counselors, would not make sense to do crowdsourcing, right? But wait, I will also, you know, looking at all the options, like the issue, like for example, Amazon Mechanical Turk or MTurk, um, yes, it's cheaper, but here's the concern is that they don't have as many mechanisms as some other providers to basically say, this isn't just someone who's just like taking the survey or like self-identifying, right? But really like someone who like, this is like, we're really trying to get as best data, accurate data as possible. So we're in the process right now of signing a contract with Qualtrics. So yeah. But I do give a good recommendation to Qualtrics, and Jasmine and Nicole, if you want to certainly contribute or share like your process with that as well, feel free to do so.
Yeah, I was gonna say Qualtrics is awesome. Their representatives are awesome. They're so friendly in taking down like everything you need, your inclusion criteria, what your sample size needs to be. They are so willing to work with you on, especially for us, because it was really important for us to be able to get participants who really and truly identify with the characteristics that we need. So SGM couples and BIPOC individuals. And so we wanted to make sure that we paid special attention to that. And Qualtrics was really accepting of that and really adamant to work with us to make sure that we got participants who met our needs and the qualifications for the study.
Yeah, the other really nice part was that they do almost like a quality control of the responses that you get. And so they'll be checking to make sure nobody's Christmas treeing and you wouldn't be paying, right, for a response that's not quality. That paired with the individualized attention, I think I'm on agreement with Dr. Chan and Jasmine. Is really great experience with them so far.
The other piece too that we also wanted to highlight is what we not only would like to expand in our own research, but also what we encourage everybody to expand in your research, right? Is really drawing more connections on the impact of oppression on relational satisfaction. Because so I listed some of these other areas here, right? Because when we think about relational satisfaction and intimate relationship research, it can be so much more extensive. So as you think about dating and relationship formation, as you think about marriage and even beliefs on marriage, as we think about equity in relationships and power, as we think about like, you know, it's interesting because like in family science research, they frame this as division of household labor, which is such a heteronormative concept, right? Like, so yeah, it's a total like family science research term, division of household labor. But that, yeah, so again, like this is where some of what we're doing, right, is using that also to dispel heteronormative and cisnormative belief systems. So that's also another area that perhaps like you might want to also carve out in your own research as well. The other piece here is, this is coming back to my earlier point, but realizing too that now trends in research, like they recognize like of course like with marriage equality, like there are legal rights, right? But still there are still so many barriers. Like it has not precluded like people being really crappy, right? Like people are still really crappy, like even though those protections exist, and it affects perceptions that happen and pressures external to the relationship it also can impact the way how people internalize those beliefs about your relationship. So that's where we're at with future directions. I realize we went over time technically, but that is okay. We've had an exciting discussion with y'all. And feel free to contact us.